Imagine you're standing in a dimly lit chamber beneath a medieval castle, surrounded by devices so ingeniously cruel that their very existence challenges everything you thought you knew about human creativity. These aren't the famous torture instruments you've seen in movies or read about in history books. These are the forgotten methods, the secret techniques, the psychological nightmares that medieval torturers developed in the shadows of history and took to their graves rather than document for posterity. Welcome to the hidden world of medieval torture, where human ingenuity was twisted into creating suffering so precise, so methodical, and so psychologically devastating that death wasn't the worst outcome. It was the mercy that victims prayed for, but rarely received. If you think you know medieval torture from Hollywood depictions of racks and iron maidens, prepare to discover why the most effective torturers never left evidence of their methods, why the most broken victims never spoke of their experiences, and why some techniques were so horrifying that even medieval chroniclers who routinely described public executions and battlefield carnage refused to document them for fear of teaching others these arts of human destruction. Because the darkest secrets of medieval torture weren't about causing pain, they were about methodically dismantling everything that makes a person human while keeping them alive to experience every moment of their psychological disintegration. And if this glimpse into humanity's most carefully hidden cruelties is already fascinating you, as much as it both horrified and captivated me during my research, consider hitting that subscribe button, because we have many more buried historical secrets that will fundamentally alter your understanding of what humans are capable of when accountability disappears. Let's begin with perhaps the most psychologically devastating technique in the medieval torturer's arsenal: the method of accumulated hope and despair. This wasn't a single device or procedure, but a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign that could last months or even years. Victims would be subjected to cycles of improvement and degradation so precisely timed that their minds eventually shattered under the constant uncertainty of whether their situation was improving or deteriorating. The process began with periods of relatively decent treatment. Prisoners would receive better food, cleaner water, warmer clothes, and even small comforts like books or musical instruments. Guards would become friendly, almost apologetic about the prisoner's situation, suggesting that their case was being reviewed favorably and that release might be imminent. Medical care would be provided for existing injuries, and prisoners would be moved to better cells with actual windows and furniture. Just as hope began to take root, and prisoners started to believe that their nightmare was ending, everything would be stripped away without warning or explanation. The books would be confiscated, the warm clothes removed, the food reduced to moldy scraps, and the friendly guards would become hostile strangers who acted as if they had never shown kindness. Prisoners would be moved back to worse cells, often in conditions more horrible than their original imprisonment. This cycle would repeat with variations designed to prevent prisoners from recognizing the pattern. Sometimes the good periods would last days, sometimes weeks, sometimes only hours. The bad periods would vary similarly, creating an unpredictable emotional roller coaster that prevented victims from developing any stable psychological defenses. Their minds, constantly whipsawed between hope and despair, would eventually lose the ability to distinguish between reality and manipulation. The most diabolical aspect of this technique was that it required no special equipment, left no physical evidence, and could be applied to multiple prisoners simultaneously while appearing to outside observers as inconsistent but not deliberately cruel treatment. Prisoners subjected to this method often developed what we would now recognize as severe dissociative disorders, losing their sense of identity and reality in ways that made them unreliable witnesses to their own experiences. The second hidden torture method exploited one of humanity's most fundamental needs: the need for human connection and communication. The technique of strategic isolation wasn't simply solitary confinement as we understand it today. It was a precisely calibrated form of sensory and social deprivation that systematically destroyed prisoners' ability to maintain their sanity through internal dialogue and memory. Victims would be placed in specially constructed cells that eliminated not just human contact, but all meaningful sensory input. These chambers were designed to muffle sound so completely that prisoners couldn't even hear their own footsteps or breathing clearly. The walls were covered with materials that absorbed rather than reflected sound, creating an acoustic environment that seemed to swallow voices and thoughts alike. But the truly insidious element was the strategic reintroduction of human contact in ways designed to make prisoners question their own memories and perceptions. After weeks or months of complete isolation, guards would briefly appear and engage prisoners in conversations about events that had supposedly occurred during their imprisonment, events that the prisoners had no memory of experiencing. These fabricated interactions would be described in vivid detail, with guards acting confused and concerned that the prisoner couldn't remember important conversations, visits from family members, or agreements they had supposedly made. Medical examinations would be described that had allegedly revealed serious health problems, or legal proceedings that had supposedly determined their guilt or innocence. Over time, prisoners began to doubt their own memories and mental faculties. They would start to believe that their isolation had caused them to forget important events, that their minds were more damaged than they realized, and that their perceptions of their treatment were unreliable. This psychological uncertainty made them more compliant and more likely to accept whatever narrative their captors presented as truth. The third secret technique targeted something even more fundamental than memory or hope: the human need for physical autonomy and bodily integrity. The method of progressive bodily estrangement involved a series of procedures designed to make prisoners feel increasingly disconnected from their own bodies, as if they were becoming unwilling passengers in flesh that no longer belonged to them. This process began with seemingly medical examinations that were actually designed to violate personal boundaries in ways that were technically non-sexual but profoundly invasive. Prisoners would be subjected to detailed physical inspections, measurements and documentation that treated their bodies as objects for study rather than as integral parts of human beings. Hair would be removed from various parts of the body in asymmetrical patterns that made prisoners feel disfigured and alien to themselves. Temporary tattoos or markings would be applied and removed in cycles, constantly changing the prisoner's appearance in ways that made them feel like they were inhabiting a stranger's body. Clothing would be replaced with garments that fit improperly, felt uncomfortable, or were designed to make normal movement difficult. More sophisticated versions of this technique involved the use of substances that caused temporary but noticeable changes in bodily functions. Prisoners might be given foods or medicines that altered their voice, changed their body odor, affected their coordination, or caused other physical changes that made them feel like strangers to themselves. The psychological impact was devastating because it attacked the most basic human sense of self-ownership. Prisoners began to feel like observers of their own bodies, rather than inhabitants, developing a profound sense of disconnection that made them more susceptible to other forms of manipulation and control. And speaking of psychological manipulation, if you're finding these revelations about human creativity in service of cruelty as disturbing and educational as we do, a quick subscribe would help us continue uncovering these buried chapters of history that textbooks prefer to skip. The fourth hidden torture method was perhaps the most sophisticated: the technique of manufactured guilt and complicity. This involved creating situations where prisoners were forced to participate in actions that violated their own moral codes, making them complicit in their own suffering and the suffering of others in ways that destroyed their self-respect and sense of moral identity. Prisoners would be presented with impossible choices, where all available options involved causing harm to themselves or others. They might be told that refusing to perform certain degrading acts would result in punishment for fellow prisoners, or that their family members outside the prison would face consequences for their non-compliance. These scenarios were carefully constructed to ensure that prisoners couldn't maintain their moral integrity regardless of what they chose. If they complied with degrading demands, they felt like they had betrayed their principles. If they refused, they felt responsible for the suffering that their captors inflicted on others as punishment for their defiance. Over time, prisoners accumulated a sense of moral guilt that was far more psychologically damaging than any physical torture. They began to believe that they deserved their treatment because of the compromises they had been forced to make, creating internal justifications for their captors' behavior that were more effective than any external propaganda. The most insidious versions of this technique involved forcing prisoners to participate in the torture or mistreatment of fellow inmates. Prisoners might be told that they could improve their own conditions by assisting guards in maintaining discipline, by providing information about other prisoners, or by performing administrative tasks that supported the prison's operations. These collaborations started small and innocuous, but gradually escalated to more serious forms of complicity. Prisoners who had taken the first steps found themselves trapped in cycles of cooperation that became increasingly difficult to escape without facing severe consequences for their previous actions. The fifth secret technique exploited humanity's deep need for narrative and meaning by systematically destroying prisoners' ability to construct coherent stories about their experiences. The method of narrative fragmentation involved creating experiences that were so contradictory, so apparently random, and so impossible to integrate into a meaningful story that prisoners' minds began to fracture under the cognitive load of trying to make sense of their reality. Prisoners would be subjected to treatment that alternated between extreme cruelty and unexpected kindness with no apparent pattern or logic. They might be severely punished for actions that had been rewarded the previous day, or rewarded for behaviors that had previously resulted in punishment. Guards would give contradictory orders, then punish prisoners regardless of which instructions they followed. Information about their cases, their families, and their futures would be delivered in fragments that seemed to contradict each other. Prisoners might be told simultaneously that they were being released soon, and that they had been sentenced to life imprisonment, that their families were safe, and that their relatives had been arrested, that their confessions had been accepted, and that they needed to provide more information. These contradictions weren't accidental confusion. They were carefully orchestrated to prevent prisoners from developing stable beliefs about their situation. Without a coherent narrative to organize their experiences, prisoners' minds began to lose the ability to distinguish between memory and imagination, between past and present, between what had actually happened and what they feared might happen. The psychological impact was similar to what we now understand about gaslighting, but amplified to devastating levels. Prisoners lost confidence in their ability to perceive reality accurately, making them increasingly dependent on their captors for basic information about their own experiences and circumstances. The sixth hidden technique was the method of temporal displacement, which attacked prisoners' sense of time and continuity in ways that made them lose touch with their own life stories and identities. This involved creating environments where normal time markers were eliminated and replaced with artificial cycles that gradually shifted prisoners' internal clocks until they lost all sense of when events had occurred or how long they had been imprisoned. Meals would be provided at irregular intervals that bore no relationship to normal daily rhythms. Lighting would be manipulated to create artificial days and nights that gradually shifted in length and timing. Prisoners would be moved between different cells and environments in ways that made it impossible to track the passage of time through external changes. More sophisticated versions involved providing prisoners with false information about dates, seasons, and the passage of time in the outside world. They might be told that days had passed when only hours had elapsed, or that they had been imprisoned for months when only weeks had actually gone by. Calendars and timepieces would show different dates and times, creating confusion about the most basic facts of temporal existence. The psychological impact of losing time sense was profound. Prisoners began to lose their connection to their own life stories, forgetting when important events had occurred and losing the ability to place their current experiences in the context of their broader lives. This temporal displacement made them more susceptible to suggestion and more likely to accept false memories about their past actions and experiences. Some prisoners developed what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, feeling like they were floating outside of time and unable to connect their present experiences with their past identities. They became vulnerable to manipulation because they had lost the temporal framework that normally helps humans maintain psychological continuity and resistance to external influence. The seventh technique, known in limited historical documents as the Mirror of Souls, was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture method ever developed. It involved creating detailed psychological profiles of prisoners and then using this information to construct personalized scenarios that attacked their specific fears, insecurities, and emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Interrogators would spend weeks or months learning everything possible about a prisoner's background, relationships, beliefs, and psychological makeup. They would interview family members, friends, and associates under various pretenses, gathering intimate details about the prisoner's emotional triggers, deepest fears, and most cherished beliefs. This information would then be used to create custom-designed psychological attacks that were uniquely devastating to each individual prisoner. Someone who feared abandonment might be shown fabricated evidence that their family had disowned them. A deeply religious person might be subjected to elaborate blasphemous rituals designed to convince them that they had been abandoned by God. The scenarios were often complex theatrical productions involving multiple actors playing the roles of family members, religious figures, or other important people in the prisoner's life. These performances were so convincing and so specifically tailored to the prisoner's psychology that they created profound emotional trauma that was far more effective than physical torture at breaking resistance. What made this technique particularly devastating was that it attacked the psychological foundations that normally help people survive trauma. By targeting specific emotional vulnerabilities, interrogators could create psychological wounds that were almost impossible to heal and that made prisoners doubt everything they had previously believed about themselves and their relationships. But here's an important historical reality check that provides crucial context for these horrifying techniques. These methods were not widely used or systematically documented because they required enormous resources, highly skilled practitioners, and long-term commitment that most medieval authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide. The vast majority of medieval torture was far more straightforward and brutal, involving physical pain, intimidation, and relatively simple psychological pressure. These sophisticated techniques were likely used only in special cases involving high-value prisoners, complex political situations, or interrogators who had developed unusual expertise in psychological manipulation. However, the existence of even fragmentary evidence for these methods reveals the disturbing truth that human creativity in service of cruelty is virtually unlimited when practitioners are given sufficient time, resources, and freedom from accountability. These techniques represent the cutting edge of medieval psychological warfare, developed by individuals who understood human psychology well enough to weaponize it in ways that were centuries ahead of their time. The practitioners who developed these methods were often learned individuals with backgrounds in medicine, theology, or philosophy who had turned their intellectual gifts toward understanding how to systematically destroy human psychological resilience. They were the predecessors of modern psychological warfare experts, developing techniques that would later be refined and systematized by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. The impact on victims who survived these techniques was often permanent and total. Unlike physical torture, which might leave scars that healed over time, psychological torture created internal wounds that often never healed. Survivors frequently developed what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, losing their ability to trust their own perceptions, maintain stable relationships, or function normally in society. Many became permanent psychological invalids, unable to work, form relationships, or participate in normal social activities. They lived as walking ghosts, technically alive but so psychologically damaged that they could never reclaim their former identities or build new lives from the wreckage of their experiences. The families and communities of these survivors also suffered, as they struggled to understand and care for people who had been so fundamentally changed by their experiences that they seemed like strangers wearing familiar faces. The ripple effects of psychological torture extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating secondary trauma that affected entire social networks. Perhaps most tragically, the techniques were so effective that many survivors never spoke about their experiences, either because they couldn't find words to describe what had happened to them, or because they feared that revealing the truth would somehow make them complicit in their own torture. This silence ensured that these methods remained hidden, and that future victims had no way to prepare for or resist similar treatment. The historical record of these techniques is fragmentary, precisely because they were so effective at destroying their victims' ability to bear witness to their experiences. Unlike physical torture, which left visible evidence and created martyrs who could inspire resistance, psychological torture created broken individuals who often supported their captors' narratives and denied or minimized their own suffering. The practitioners of these techniques understood that the most effective torture wasn't about extracting information or punishing crimes, but about fundamentally altering human personality and breaking the psychological mechanisms that normally allow people to resist authority and maintain independent thought. They were creating human beings who were psychologically incapable of rebellion, resistance, or even accurate memory of their experiences. So there you have it, the darkest secrets of medieval torture, exposed in all their psychological sophistication and human devastation. These weren't simple applications of physical pain, but carefully crafted assaults on the human psyche that were designed to destroy everything that makes a person who they are, while leaving them technically alive to serve as warnings to others. These techniques reveal that medieval society contained individuals who understood human psychology well enough to systematically weaponize it in ways that wouldn't be systematically studied again until the 20th century. They represent humanity's capacity for evil, when intelligent, educated people decide to use their gifts in service of cruelty rather than healing or progress. The legacy of these methods serves as a sobering reminder that psychological torture can be far more devastating than physical violence, and that the human capacity for both creativity and cruelty knows virtually no bounds when accountability and oversight are removed. They show us why psychological rights and protections are just as important as physical ones, and why we must remain vigilant against the sophisticated methods that authoritarian systems use to break human resistance. The next time you encounter discussions about human rights, interrogation techniques, or the treatment of prisoners, remember these medieval victims who faced psychological assaults so sophisticated and devastating that they make modern debates about enhanced interrogation seem almost quaint by comparison. Because the darkest secrets of medieval torture weren't about medieval brutality, they were about timeless human vulnerabilities that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. And since you've journeyed with us through these darkest chapters of human ingenuity turned toward evil, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments below, because it amazes us that these buried secrets of history reach people everywhere, serving as crucial reminders of what we must never allow ourselves to become again. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I live in an era where psychological rights exist, however imperfectly, and where the systematic destruction of human personalities is recognized as one of the gravest crimes against humanity.